What if that nagging feeling in the back of your neck was real? What if those hands reaching out from the dark that you believed were there were there? What if the monster in the basement really existed? And what if there was really something under the bed? Would you have the courage to face your fears?
Hello, brave souls. Today we got, it's part 6 technically of the, I thought I was a zombie slayer before the zombie apocalypse started and then realized he was a big old baby. If you haven't listened to the story yet, so basically the general premise of the story was there was this guy, he thought he was like this big time zombie expert before the zombie apocalypse happened. And then as soon as it happened, he like freaked out, did not know how to take care of himself that well, ended up like in an attic with a frying pan, trying to keep himself safe. Fast forward a little bit, he meets up with some people. He starts to actually learn how to actually keep yourself alive during the zombie apocalypse and becomes a solid member of the community, and then he's becoming the ambassador of a neighboring community that they're hopeful to have a cure for. So, like I said, if you don't feel like going back and watching the other video, which is about an hour long, that's basically the general gist of what happened last time. So now we can get right into part 6. So, part 6, the network. The Greenfield community was nothing like Mike had expected. While the community college camp had repurposed existing structures with practical efficiency, Greenfield had transformed an old shopping mall into a thriving indoor village. The high ceilings of what had once been department stores now supported hanging gardens. The food court had become a communal dining hall and market. Storefronts had been converted into living quarters, workshops, and medical facilities. Impressive, Elena murmured as they were escorted through the central atrium. They've built something sustainable here. Captain Ward nodded. Greenfield is one of our most organized allies. Over 700 residents, extensive agriculture in the surrounding areas, even small-scale manufacturing. Mike took careful mental notes as they walked. In his previous life, he would have immediately begun comparing this setup to his own theories and ideal zombie survival compounds, pointing out flaws and offering unsolicited advice. Now, he simply observed and learned, appreciating the ingenuity and hard work that had gone into creating this haven. Mayor Sullivan is waiting for you, their escort said, leading them toward what had once been a mall management office. Mayor Sullivan proved to be a pragmatic woman in her 60s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that missed nothing. She greeted Ward warmly, but assessed Mike and Elena with careful scrutiny. New representatives from the college community, Ward explained. Mike Callahan and Elena Diaz. They brought a cooler of treatment samples and are joining our network. Sullivan's eyes narrowed slightly at Mike. Callahan. Why does that name sound familiar? Mike felt a flush of embarrassment, but decided honesty was the best approach. He used to run a zombie survival forum before the outbreak. Published some ebooks, too. Nothing particularly useful, as it turned out. To his surprise, Sullivan laughed. I remember now. My nephew was obsessed with your videos. The Callahan protocol, right? He'd practice your techniques in the backyard. Mike nodded, waiting for the inevitable mockery. Instead, Sullivan's expression softened. He didn't make it. But your videos gave him something to be passionate about. A sense of purpose. Can't fault that. Mike wasn't sure how to respond. His content had been based on movies, games, and speculation. Hardly the real expertise the world needed when the crisis actually came. Yet here was someone finding value in it, if only as a connection to a loved one who was gone now. I'm sorry for your loss, he said simply. Sullivan nodded in acknowledgement, then smoothly transitioned to business. Captain Ward tells me you've established a network to share the treatment protocol. What role does your community plan to play in this alliance? Mike had prepared for this question during the journey. We offer strategic location, experienced scavenging teams, and adaptability. We're smaller than Greenfield, but we've developed efficient systems for resource gathering and perimeter security, And what do you personally bring to the table, Mr. Callahan? Sullivan pressed. Why should I trust you as a representative? It was a fair question. 6 months ago, Mike would have launched into an exaggerated account of his expertise, citing his forum credentials and theoretical knowledge. Now, he opted for the truth. I bring failure, he said quietly. Sullivan raised an eyebrow. I failed spectacularly when the outbreak first happened, Mike continued. All my theories fell apart. I panicked, froze, hid in an attic until military personnel rescued me. But I learned from those failures, adapted, found that real survival isn't about lone heroes with perfect plans, but communities working together, solving problems as they arise. He gestured to Elena beside him. I bring partnerships with people smarter and more capable than me in different areas. People who complement my skills and check my assumptions. Sullivan studied him for a long moment, then smiled slightly. Humility. That's unfortunately rare these days. She reached for a folder on her desk. I think we can work together, Mr. Callahan. Here's what Greenfield can contribute to the Alliance. As they discussed logistics, supplies, communication protocols, security measures, Mike reflected on how differently this conversation would have gone if he were still the self-proclaimed expert from before the outbreak. That version of Mike would have been busy pointing out flaws in Greenfield's setup, positioning himself as the authority on apocalypse survival. Instead, he was listening, learning, contributing where he could add value, and deferring where others knew more. 3 weeks later, Mike and Elena had visited 5 communities, helping to establish a network that reached across 3 counties. Each location had its own approach to survival, its own strengths and vulnerabilities. Mike documented everything in his notebook, not to criticize, but to understand. They were camping at an abandoned park ranger station, halfway between communities, when Elena brought it up. You're different now, she said, warming her hands over their small fire. I knew you before, you know? Mike looked up from his notebook. Before the outbreak? I don't remember meeting you. Elena smiled. You wouldn't. I attended one of your talks at a convention. Zombie apocalypse preparation. The Callahan method. You were so certain about everything. So absolute. I actually asked a question about community cooperation versus individual preparation. Mike winced, suddenly recalling the event. And I said something about how groups slow you down and increase your risk profile. You said, in the apocalypse, other people are your biggest liabilities, Elena confirmed. And now look at you, literally building an alliance of communities. Mike closed his notebook, embarrassed by the memory. I was an idiot. No, Elena said thoughtfully. You were just untested. Theories are easy when there's no consequence for being wrong. Reality is a better teacher than speculation. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the crackling fire and distant calls of nocturnal birds the only sounds. Do you ever miss it? Elena finally asked. The certainty? Feeling like you had all the answers? Mike considered the question seriously. Sometimes, he admitted. There was a comfort in thinking I had it all figured out. The world made more sense in this neat, organized way where every problem had a solution I'd already planned for. He stared into the fire. But it wasn't real. And what I have now. He looked at Elena. The connections, the actual skills, the knowledge earned through experience. That's worth more than any false certainty. Elena nodded, moving to sit beside him. Worth more than your collection of zombie-slaying machetes? Mike laughed. Definitely. Though, I have to admit, a good machete would come in handy sometimes. I don't know, Elena teased, leaning against his shoulder. You've done pretty well with a frying pan. The attack came 3 days later as they approached the outskirts of the Riverdale community, their final stop before returning to the college. They had just crested a hill when Elena grabbed Mike's arm, pulling him down behind an abandoned car. Below them, The road leading to Riverdale was blocked by a makeshift barricade. Armed figures in mismatched tactical gear checked vehicles attempting to pass. Not military, Mike whispered. Holy crap, I can't talk tonight, guys, sorry. Not military, Mike whispered, raising his binoculars. And not Riverdale security either. Through the lenses, he could make out a symbol spray painted on the barricade, a crossed-out medical cross. Remember what Ward said? About groups opposing the treatment? Elena whispered. Mike nodded grimly. They had heard rumors at the last stop. A faction called themselves True Survivors, who believed the infection was nature's way of separating the strong from the weak. They preached that medical intervention was interfering with natural selection. We need to warn Riverdale, Elena said, and find another way in. Mike studied the terrain through his binoculars. There's a service road about a half a mile east. Probably leads to the water treatment facility that Riverdale uses. We can try that. The detour took them through dense woodland, moving carefully to avoid detection. Mike found himself automatically employing skills he'd only once theorized about. Moving quietly, staying downwind, checking for signs of human activity. They were halfway to the service road when they heard the gunshots. That's coming from Riverdale, Elena said, alarmed. They exchanged a look, both knowing they should stay hidden, avoid the conflict. The medical cooler they'd carried contained only 2 remaining treatment doses, valuable beyond measure, but not worth their lives. But there were people in Riverdale, people waiting for the treatment protocol, people who were part of the growing network of hope. What would the old Mike do? Elena asked quietly. Hide. Protect himself first, Mike answered without hesitation. Probably write a forum post later about optimal evasion tactics. Elena nodded. And now? Mike adjusted his pack, feeling the weight of the cooler inside. Now we find a way to help. Together. They moved toward Riverdale, no longer self-proclaimed experts hiding from reality, but true survivors walking purposefully toward it, ready to face whatever came next with open eyes and steady hands. The future was uncertain, the path forward unclear, but that was the final lesson Mike had learned. Real expertise wasn't about having all the answers. It was about having the courage to face the questions. And he wasn't facing them alone. Part 7. The Confrontation. Mike and Elena crouched behind an abandoned truck, watching the scene unfold at Riverdale's main gate. The true survivors had positioned themselves just beyond the community's defensive perimeter, using the cover of several rusted vehicles as they exchanged gunfire with Riverdale's guards. This isn't just a blockade, Elena whispered. It's a coordinated attack. Mike nodded grimly. From their vantage point, he could see that the true survivors had encircled the community's eastern side, cutting off the main entrance and the emergency exit. They were trying to force their way in, or more worryingly, force the inhabitants out. We need to get inside and warn them about what's coming, Mike said. These guys will have more fighters on the way. Elena pointed toward the water treatment facility they'd spotted earlier. That's still our best bet. The service road might be clear. They moved carefully through the dense undergrowth, staying low and maintaining silence. Skills Mike had theorized about for years, but only truly mastered in the past months of actual survival. The weight of the medical cooler in his pack reminded him of what was at stake. 2 remaining doses of the treatment. A flash drive with the full protocol. Hope for humanity's future. The water treatment plant was a small facility on the banks of a creek, connected to Riverdale by a chain-link fence corridor. As they approached, Mike held up his hand, signaling Elena to stop. 2 figures in the same mismatched tactical gear as the roadblock guards patrolling the perimeter. They've thought of everything, Elena whispered. They're cutting off all access points. Mike scanned the area, considering their options. In his previous life, he'd have had a dozen theories about the tactically optimal approach to the situation. Now, he was simply looking for what would actually work with the resources they had. We can't take them in a direct confrontation, he said quietly. We need a distraction. Elena studied the facility. The treatment plant probably has chemicals. Maybe we could create some smoke? That would draw more attention this way, Mike said. We need something to pull them away from here. He thought for a moment, then rummaged in his pack. I have an idea. From his supplies, Mike produced a small portable radio, one of the essentials every scavenging team carried. He switched it on, keeping the volume low, and began scanning through frequencies until he found static. What are you doing? Elena asked. Creating a ghost, Mike replied. He climbed partway up a nearby tree, secured the radio in a high branch, and turned the volume up to maximum. The sudden burst of static and noise echoed through the quiet forest. The effect was immediate. The patrolling guards turned toward the sound, weapons raised. Go check it out, one of them called to the others. I'll watch the perimeter. Mike and Elena waited until the first guard had disappeared into the trees, then carefully circled around to approach from the blind side of the remaining guard. They'd worked together long enough now to move as a synchronized unit. No words needed. Elena picked up a fist-sized rock and threw it as far as to the left as she could, creating a distracting noise, while Mike moved swiftly behind the guard. He didn't like violence. I learned it was rarely the solution it appeared to be in his pre-breakout fantasies. But sometimes it was necessary. A quick strike with the handle of his knife rendered the guard unconscious. Elena was already moving to zip-tie the man's hands and feet. He'll be out for an hour, maybe less, Mike said. Let's move. They made their way through the service entrance and followed the pipeline corridor toward Riverdale's walls. The sounds of gunfire had intensified. The true survivors were escalating their attack. At the interior fence, they found themselves facing the business end of several rifles held by nervous-looking Riverdale guards. Hold your fire! Mike called out, raising his hands. We're from the community college. Captain Ward sent us with medical supplies and information. The guards exchanged glances before their leader. A woman with a ragged scar across her cheek nodded. Prove it. Mike slowly reached into his pocket and produced the official papers from Ward, complete with the Aberdeen stamp, an identification system the Alliance communities had established to verify messengers. After careful examination, the guard captain lowered her weapon. Get inside, quickly. I'm Sergeant Harris. We've been expecting representatives from the Alliance, but not in the middle of a firefight. Once inside Riverdale's walls, Mike and Elena were rushed to a command center set up in what had once been a police station. Maps covered the walls, communication equipment hummed, and harried-looking people moved with purpose. A tall, broad-shouldered man with graying temples looked up from the central tables as they entered. I'm Beckett, Riverdale's director. You picked one hell of a time for a visit. The true survivors followed us, Mike said, getting straight to the point. They're targeting Alliance communities, specifically these accepting the treatment protocol. Beckett's expression darkened. We suspected as much. They've been broadcasting propaganda on all frequencies for the past week, claiming the treatment is a plot to weaken survivors, that only the naturally immune deserve to rebuild society. How many fighters do they have out there? Elena asked. We've counted at least 30, Sergeant Harris replied. Better armed than we'd expect for a fringe group. They've got military-grade weapons. Mike felt a chill. They're not just a fringe group anymore. They're organized, with resources. Have you contacted Aberdeen or any other Alliance communities for help? Beckett shook his head. Communications have been jammed since the attack began. We can't get any signals out. Mike exchanged a glance with Elena. They were on their own. What are your defenses? He asked. We have the walls, about 20 trained fighters, some basic traps and alarms. Enough to hold them off for now. But if they bring in more people... Beckett didn't need to finish the thought. Mike studied the maps on the wall, detailed layouts of Riverdale and the surrounding area. His mind raced through scenarios, but not like before. This wasn't theoretical planning from the safety of an internet forum. This was real, with real lives at stake. You've been in communication with the other Alliance communities, Elena said. You must have established fallback protocols, emergency rendezvous points. Beckett nodded. There's a designated safe location about 15 miles north. If Riverdale falls, Survivors are to make their way there. Aberdeen has a listening post that checks for signals from the locations twice daily. Mike studied the maps more carefully, focusing on topography, lines of sight, potential choke points. Years of analyzing zombie outbreak scenarios had given him one useful skill: the ability to evaluate terrain for defensive purposes. The difference now was that he understood the human element, the fear, the exhaustion, the need for hope that drove real people in crisis. "I think I have an idea," he said finally. "But it's going to require something we don't have much of." "What's that?" Beckett asked. Mike turned to face him. "Trust. Between all of us." Night fell over Riverdale as Mike outlined his plan to the community leadership. It wasn't the glamorous action hero scenario he pre-outbreak self had imagined. There were no dramatic last stands, no solo missions behind enemy lines. Instead, it was practical, collaborative, and built on a simple truth he'd learned since the world changed. Survival wasn't about being the strongest or most heavily armed. It was about adapting, misdirection, and understanding human psychology. "The true survivors want two things," Mike explained: the destruction of the treatment protocol and a victory to prove their ideology. We can use both desires against them. The plan was risky but straightforward. They would make it appear that Riverdale was evacuating, abandoning the settlement and taking the treatment protocol with them. A small, visible group would leave through a northern exit, drawing the true survivors, forces into pursuit. Meanwhile, the majority of Riverdale's people would remain hidden within the settlement, protected by a minimal defensive force. "You're suggesting we use our own people as bait?" Sergeant Harris said, clearly uncomfortable with the idea. "No," Mike corrected. "Elena and I will lead the decoy group. We're the ones carrying the treatment protocol. We're who they really want." Elena nodded in agreement, though Mike could see the concern in her eyes. "We'll lead them away from Riverdale, toward the listening post," Mike continued. "If we can restore communications with Aberdeen, Captain Ward can send reinforcements." Beckett studied the map where Mike had traced the proposed route. "That's at least 10 miles through hostile territory, with armed pursuers. The two of you won't make it alone." "We'll need 3 volunteers," Mike acknowledged. "People who know the terrain and can quickly move quietly." To Mike's surprise, Sergeant Harris was the first to step forward. "I'll go. I grew up in these woods. Know them better than anyone." 2 more volunteers joined: a former park ranger named Whitley and a young woman called Tess who had been a cross-country runner before the outbreak. As the others left to prepare, Elena pulled Mike aside. "This isn't what I expected when he set out to deliver medicine." Mike smiled ruefully. "Nothing ever goes according to plan anymore. That's the biggest lesson I've learned." "Are you scared?" she asked quietly. Mike considered the question honestly. The old Mike would have been blustered, claimed fearlessness, cited his extensive preparations for exactly this kind of scenario. "Terrified," he admitted. "But that's okay. Fear keeps you alert, keeps you honest." Elena squeezed his hand. "Remember the attic? How could I forget? Hiding with a frying pan while the world fell apart? You survived," she pointed out. "Sometimes surviving is enough. And sometimes it's just the beginning." Mike looked at the maps, at the daunting route they would need to navigate, at the true survivors' positions marked in red. Then he looked at Elena, at the determination in her eyes, at the strength that had nothing to do with weapons or tactics or zombie-killing machetes. "This isn't just about surviving anymore," he said. "It's about what kind of world survives with us. The true survivors want one built on strength, on excluding the vulnerable, on letting the infected die. It's not a world worth building." Elena nodded. "So we'll build a different one. Together." Outside, the gunfire had momentarily ceased. A tense silence before the true survivors' next push. Dawn was still hours away in the darkness. They could make their move. Mike checked the medical cooler one last time. 2 precious treatment doses. A flash drive to humanity's best hope. Knowledge that could save countless lives, if they could get it through. The self-proclaimed zombie expert had once dreamed of being a hero in the apocalypse. Now, faced with actual heroism, he found it looked nothing like his fantasies. It was quieter, harder, filled with doubt and compromise, and no guarantee of success. But as he shouldered his pack and prepared to move out with the small decoy team, Mike realized he wouldn't trade this reality, with all its fear and uncertainty, for any of his former delusions of expertise. Because now, he was doing something that mattered. Part 8. The Journey. The pre-dawn air was crisp and heavy with fog as Mike and the decoy team slipped out of Riverdale's northern emergency exit. Perfect conditions for their escape. The mist provided visual cover while the damp air would help mask their scent from any infected they might encounter. Nature, for once, was cooperating. Their group moved in formation. Sergeant Harris on point, then Tess, followed by Mike and Elena with the precious medical cooler, and Whitley covering their rear. They had agreed to maintain radio silence until absolutely necessary. The true survivors might be monitoring frequencies. Remember, Mike had told them during the final briefing, our goal isn't to outfight them. It's to outlast them. We lead them away from Riverdale, maintain distance, and make it to the listening post. No heroics. The irony wasn't lost on him. The old Mike, the self-proclaimed zombie expert, would have devised some elaborate combat strategy, imagining himself leading a valiant last stand against the enemy. Now, he knew better. Real expertise lay in avoiding unnecessary risks and choosing the path of least resistance. They moved through the forest, following game trails and creek beds, deliberately leaving subtle signs of their passage. Broken twigs, disturbed underbrush, occasional footprints in the soft soil. Not enough to create an obvious trail, but sufficient for determined pursuers to follow. You really think they'll take the bait? Whitley whispered as they paused to check their bearings. They have to, Mike responded. Their whole ideology depends on stopping the treatment protocol from spreading. If word gets out that infected people can be saved, that this isn't the end of civilization, but just another challenge to overcome, then they lose their power, Elena finished. Their whole worldview collapses. Sergeant Harris signaled from ahead, dropping to a crouch. Everyone immediately followed suit, freezing in place. Mike tensed, hand moving to the knife at his belt. Still his preferred tool since the first chaotic escape through the tunnels months ago. Harris pointed silently to their right. Through the thinning mist, Mike could make out the shambling forms of 3 infected moving parallel to their path, about 50 yards away. Too close for comfort, but not an immediate threat if they stayed quiet and still. The group held their position, barely breathing as the infected passed. Mike studied them with what he had become a professional eye. Their movements were uncoordinated but purposeful. Mid-stage infection. Still dangerous but not as hyper-aggressive as the newly turned. Their clothes were weathered and torn, suggesting they'd been wandering for months. Once the threat had passed, Harris signaled for them to continue, now moving with even greater caution. They had covered perhaps 4 miles when the first sounds of pursuit reached them. Distant voices, the crack of branches, the occasional metallic sound of equipment shifting. They picked up our trail, Harris confirmed, after a quick recon. At least 8 of them, moving fast. Mike had expected this. Time for Phase 2 then. Phase 2 of their plan involved splitting up temporarily. Tess, the fastest among them, would take a slightly different route with clear tracks, drawing the immediate pursuit, while the rest of the group continued toward the listening post at a steady pace. They would rendezvous at a designated point 2 miles ahead. Remember, don't engage, Mike told Tess. Just keep them moving. Keep them distracted. Tess nodded, her expression determined beneath her close-cropped hair. I grew up outrunning boys who thought they were faster than me. These guys won't be any different. She adjusted her pack. See you at the creek crossing. With that, she was gone, veering northeast through the forest, intentionally leaving a clearer trail. The remainder of the group continued forward, moving as quietly as possible while maintaining their pace. Mike checked his watch. They'd been on the move for nearly 3 hours. The listening post was still at least 6 miles away. "We're making good time," Elena said, reading his thoughts. "Not good enough," he replied quietly. "They're better organized than we expected. If they've sent a group after us, they might have others circling to cut us off." Harris grunted in agreement. True survivors have been recruiting. A lot of ex-military types who couldn't adjust to taking orders from civilian leadership in the safe zones. People who think strength is all that matters now. "Strength matters," Whitley commented, "but it's not the only thing that matters. That's what they don't get." Mike reflected on this as they continued. Before the outbreak, he'd been fixated on physical preparation, weapons, tactics, supplies. He'd equated survival with the ability to defend oneself, to overcome threats through force or evasion. Now he understood that long-term survival required something more complex: community, cooperation, adaptation, and purpose. These thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of gunfire. 2 shots, followed by a third. "That's coming from Tess's direction," Whitley said, alarm evident in his voice. Harris checked the map. "The rendezvous point is just ahead. We stick to the plan. She knows what she's doing." They pressed on, but Mike could feel the tension building within the group. Had Tess been discovered? Injured? Captured? The uncertainty weighing on them all. When they reached the creek crossing, a shallow ford where several fallen trees created a natural bridge, there was no sign of Tess. They waited, concealed among the underbrush, watching both the path they'd come from and the route Tess should have taken. 10 minutes passed, then 20. "Something's wrong," Whitley finally said, voicing what they all knew. "She should have been here by now." Mike considered their options. Waiting longer put them all at risk. Moving on meant potentially abandoning Tess. Going back to look for her would lead them into an ambush. In his former life, Mike would have had a ready answer, some theoretical best practice for exactly this scenario. Now, he understood there was no perfect solutions, only difficult choices with unknown consequences. "Harris," he said finally, "you and Whitley continue to the listening post with the medical cooler. Elena and I will backtrack and try to find Tess." Harris frowned. "That's not the plan we agreed on." "Plans change when circumstances change," Mike replied. "The treatment protocol is what matters most. It needs to get through. But we don't leave our people behind if we can help it." After a moment, Harris nodded. 2 hours. If you don't find her in that time, you head straight to the rendezvous point. No heroics, like you said. "No heroics," Mike agreed, handing over the medical cooler. "Just a quick search, then we'll catch up." As Harris and Whitley continued north with the precious cargo, Mike and Elena retraced their steps, moving carefully but quickly toward the area where they'd heard the gunshots. "This isn't very zombie expert-like behavior," Elena whispered as they navigated the dense forest. "Going back for someone is how people get killed in horror movies." Mike smiled beside the tension. "Good thing we're not in a movie." They moved about half a mile before Elena suddenly grabbed Mike's arm, pulling him down a fallen log. Ahead, voices could be heard, harsh, commanding tones that didn't belong to Tess. "Waste of ammo. We're supposed to follow, not engage," someone was saying. "She was moving too fast, circling around, probably trying to flank us." Another voice responded defensively. "I had to slow her down." Mike and Elena exchanged glances. The true survivors had shot Tess. Maybe hit her. But she was fast, resourceful. She might have escaped. They crawled forward, using the underbrush for cover, until they could see a small clearing where 4 armed figures were gathered. One was kneeling, examining the ground. "Blood trail leads that way," the kneeling figure announced, pointing west. "Not much blood, though. Probably just winged her." "Good," said the apparent leader, a tall man with a distinctive red bandana tied around his arm. "Dawson, Taylor, you follow the trail. Stevens, you're with me. We keep on the main group's tracks. They have what we're really after." Mike felt cold anger building inside him. These people had shot Tess, were hunting her like an animal. In his old zombie scenarios, He'd always imagined himself fighting against the mindless infected, never against other thinking, feeling humans who had chosen cruelty as their path. As the true survivors split up, 2 following Tess's blood trail, 2 continuing on to the main path, Mike and Elena waited until they were out of earshot before conferring. "We can't take all 4, Elena whispered, "but we might be able to help Tess if we can go after the other 2 following her." Mike nodded. "We need to be smart about this. No direct confrontation if we can avoid it." They moved carefully, paralleling the path of the 2 men tracking Tess. Years of theorizing about stealth and woodland movements were finally proving useful, though not in the way Mike had ever imagined. This wasn't about avoiding zombies. It was about outthinking other humans who had embraced the worst aspects of survival. After about 20 minutes of careful stalking, they heard voices ahead. "She can't have gone far. Not with that wound." "Yeah, well, spread out. Check those bushes. She's hiding somewhere." Mike peered through the foliage. The 2 men, Dawson and Taylor presumably, were about 30 yards ahead, weapons ready as they searched the dense thicket. Of Tess, there was no sign. "Distraction?" Elena mouthed. Mike nodded, pointing to their left, where the ground sloped down toward what might have been a seasonal creek bed. Elena understood immediately. She picked up a heavy stick and moved carefully in that direction, while Mike circled around, approaching the men from behind. A minute later, a loud crack echoed from the direction Elena had gone, the sound of wood striking wood, like someone stumbling and catching themselves. Both men immediately turned toward the noise, weapons raised. "Down there!" one called. "I see movement!" They started moving toward the sound, just as Mike had hoped. He continued his careful approach, searching for any sign of Tess in the area they'd been examining. A small smear of blood on a tree trunk caught his eye. Following the direction, he noticed disturbed earth leading to a hollow beneath a fallen tree, the kind of natural shelter anyone with woodland knowledge would recognize. Mike approached cautiously. "Tess," he whispered. "It's Mike. We came back for you." For a moment, there was silence. Then the underbrush shifted slightly, and Tess's dirt-streaked face appeared. Her right shoulder was bloody, a crude bandage fashioned from torn fabric wrapped around it. "Took you long enough," she said through gritted teeth, "though I was going to have to take care of these guys myself." Relief flooded through Mike. "Can you move?" Tess nodded. "Bullet grazed me. Hurts like hell, but nothing's broken." "Elena's distracting them. But we don't have much time. We need to..." He stopped as the sound of a shout, followed by Elena's voice, raised in alarm. Then came the unmistakable sound of a struggle. Mike's blood went cold. "Stay hidden," he told Tess. "I'll be back with Elena." Moving as quickly as stealth allowed, Mike headed toward the sounds of the confrontation. All his instincts screamed at him to rush in, to help Elena immediately, but he forced himself to proceed carefully. Charging blindly would only get them both captured or killed. Through the trees, he could see one of the men holding Elena, her arms pinned behind her. The other was questioning her, weapon pointed at her face. "Where are the others?" the man demanded. "Where's the medical cooler?" Elena's response was defiant. "Gone. Far away by now. You've lost." The man struck her across the face, and Mike felt something inside him break. All his careful planning, all his measured responses, they have vanished in an instant of pure protective rage. The old Mike would have hesitated, analyzed, theorized about the optimal approach. The new Mike simply acted. He burst from cover, crowbar raised, the same tool that had saved his life in the tunnels now an extension of his fury. The nearest man turned, raising his weapon, but too slowly. Mike struck with all his strength, feeling the impact shudder up his arm as the man crumpled. The second man released Elena and swung his rifle toward Mike. Elena, freed, drove her elbow hard into the captor's solar plexus. He doubled over, gasping, and she followed with a knee to his face that sent him sprawling. For a moment, they stood there, breathing hard, surrounded by their fallen enemies. "So much for no direct confrontation," Elena said finally, wiping blood from her split lip. Mike checked that both men were unconscious but alive. "Sometimes plans change," he replied, echoing his earlier words. You okay? She nodded. Found Tess? Yeah, she's injured but mobile. Mike quickly collected the true survivor's weapons, removing ammo and tossing the guns in the underbrush. Not destroying them, but making them temporarily useless. We need to move fast. Their friends will come looking when they don't report back. They retrieved Tess from her hiding place and set out northward, away from Riverdale and toward the listening post where Harris and Whitley should already be establishing contact with Aberdeen. Their pace was slower now, hampered by Tess's injury, but they pushed on with renewed determination. As they walked, Mike found himself reflecting on the confrontation. His reaction had surprised him, the instant, protective fury that had overridden his careful planning. It wasn't the calculated violence of his pre-outbreak zombie-killing fantasies. It was something more primal, more human. The need to protect those he cared about. You're thinking too loud, Elena said after a while, falling into step beside him. Just wondering what the old me would have thought about all this, Mike admitted. Going back for someone. Getting in a fight we could have avoided. Elena studied him for a moment. The old you was too busy preparing for the end of the world that he forgot what was worth saving in it. Ahead of them, there were breaks in the canopy. They could see the sun climbing toward its zenith. They still had miles to go, with injured Tess and likely more true survivors between them and safety. The journey ahead would be difficult and dangerous. But Mike found himself filled with a quiet certainty that nothing to do with this former misplaced confidence. This wasn't the expertise of theory, but of experience. The knowledge that they would face whatever came next together, adapting, learning, and surviving. Not because they had all the answers, but because they were willing to find them. All right, guys, that's where I'm going to leave it for tonight. My kids need me to tuck them into bed, so I got to get going. But I hope you guys enjoyed the story. We'll catch back up on part 9 with Mike when we come back. And like I said, I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Come back for some more scary stories. And remember, to always face your fears.